Hello, welcome to the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building owned by the Huntington Historical Society. I am Toby Kassam, and I hope to take you on a quick tour of the exhibits that are on display here at the Society's History and Fine Arts Museum. We've been working hard over the last 6 months individually and putting together some new exhibits, and we thought this would be an appropriate time for you to look at it. This little history of this building. This building was built in 1892, and it was built by the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Association, which was a group of men basically in the town that wanted to build a memorial to the Civil War veterans. There was another group in town that had formed the Huntington Public Library in 1875, and they did not own a building, and so the two groups got together, and this was built as the memorial to the Civil War soldiers as well as the public library. And it served as the public library until 1958, and there are some shots over here of the building as a library. It was given to the Society in 2000, and it took us a while. The roof needed to be replaced and the plaster was falling down. But we were using it as an exhibit space since 2008 when we set our first exhibit up to illustrate or to show off some of the archives, the historic objects in the collection of the Huntington Historical Society. And we've done it by setting up small exhibits around the building, and I would like to take you through some of them briefly. Thank you. We had hoped to open these exhibits, these new exhibits, in the spring, or late spring or early summer of this year to celebrate certain anniversaries in 2020. Of course, things got changed with the circumstances, and we're still in 2020 to open up these exhibits, at least virtually. This is about an illustrator that was in town, that lived in Huntington later in his life, from Kansas. He was born in Kansas, and early in his life he moved to New York as an illustrator and worked for advertising agencies. He met a woman and married. In the mid-1940s, before the end of the war, he joined the Army and as a graphic artist, and at the end of the war he was assigned to the European Theater of Operations Office of General Dwight David Eisenhower, and he celebrated the liberation of Paris, which of course is celebrating its 75th anniversary. There are illustrations of Paris at that time that he made. He also did a portrait of Dwight David Eisenhower that was on the cover of the Army Talks magazine, and he presented that to Eisenhower later after it was published. And he has a letter here signed by Eisenhower thanking him for the wonderful portrait that he did of him. There are some other illustrations here that he's done, a letter that he wrote to his wife from home, and so forth. So this was one of the anniversaries that we are celebrating. Also in the exhibit, which is new, is the kind of the rediscovery of this table. It was donated to the Society in 1921, and it was in the Victorian parlor, which would have been appropriate for this style table, but it was covered with the tablecloth, and so we thought it was just a typical tilt-top or round tea table. When we were restoring and going through the restoration of the parlor, we uncovered it and realized that it was a cast iron piece of furniture with a painting on the top that was kind of dull and scratched, it appeared. And so we did some research on it and discovered that in 1921 it was donated to the Society by Eleanor Biggs, who was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George W. Biggs, who lived in Huntington Station in Huntington. It was a wedding gift to them in 1848 and had been sent over from England. It was manufactured by one of the big ironworks industries in London, or in England. The painting is of the first of the Afghan wars. It was a very popular subject to paint. The first war was in 1838, and it was a very popular subject and developed a lot of paintings, and that's a very recognizable scene in Afghanistan. We've had the painting restored to look like this, and it's a fabulous restoration. It's a brilliant painting now, and it'll probably stay here on exhibit as one of the special items in the collection. Another part of the exhibit, celebrating another anniversary, is the 275th anniversary of St. John's Episcopal Church here in Huntington. It was formally formed in 1745, and the first church building was built in 1750. And it goes through, this is a timeline, is the opening of the exhibit. It illustrates a number of the people that were involved, the ministry from St. George's Church in Hempstead. The very first recorded ministry, anyway, was the 1727 marriage between the Treadwell and the Platt family that we'll talk about in another section of the church. But it goes through Daniel Whitehead Kassam, who was the owner of our house, one of our house museums on Park Avenue, was a member of the church. He was a warden. Early on in the early 1800s, he died and was buried in the church records, and this is a notation from that in 1839. A number of his descendants were involved in the church. The Paulding family from Lloyd Harbor was a big time, and we have a section that illustrates the relationship of the Paulding family in the St. John's Episcopal Church. We talk about the three buildings and what happened to the three buildings throughout its history and things that happened in those three buildings. There were a couple of chapels, outreach ministries that were done during that time, and we highlight some of the congregants of that and celebrate their contributions not only to St. John's Episcopal Church but to the general history of Huntington. In the case here we have the recording of that first marriage in 1727, and we talk about the relationship between the families, the Huntington families that all got involved throughout with the church and through intermarriage. We talk about the fact that the church was really started by that marriage, and then eventually the building was built in 1750. One of the driving forces behind that was, of course, Henry Lloyd from Lloyd Knapp. He was a member of Old First Church, but he was really interested in the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, and he was the driving force to actually get a building built. And the very first building here is captured in this painting that was done in 1861. It was actually finished in 1750, and in 1861 there was talk of building a new church building because they had outgrown this little building here. But the painting was done by James Long Scudder, and it was done for a businessman in town named Isaac Adams. He was a tinsmith that had come from Connecticut, but had gotten involved early on as a vestryman and a warden of St. John's Church. And it's interesting to follow what happened to that painting as it progressed, as years progressed. The church was actually torn down in 1862, I'm sorry. But it was, and then the new church was built, and we'll talk about that second church later. But two interesting artifacts were donated to the society in at the meeting, the December meeting in 1917. And one is this rocker, and that was made from the timbers that had been taken down, the oak timbers that had been taken down when that church was dismantled. And it descended into the Rogers family, who actually built this chair. It was built locally. There were a couple of people in town at the time that were capable of building what we call a Lincoln rocker. And the reason it's known as the Lincoln rocker, of course, is that it's the style of chair that Abraham Lincoln was sitting in Ford Theater when he was assassinated in 1865. So we're pretty sure that this style of chair was probably built in the 1860s here in Huntington. And the second donation that was made was from an artist in town, a cousin, a very distant cousin of James Long Scudder, named Timothy Fleet Scudder. And he was a sign painter and a carriage maker in town, but he was also a portrait painter and a photographer. And he presented a series of 5 paintings of the 3 church buildings to the society. And then it turns out that 6 months later, he presented the exact same assortment of paintings to the church. And this is actually the church's collection that was presented to them in July of 1918. Who made the church was built on land that's next to the AME Church today on Park Avenue, which is across from the hospital building on Park Avenue. And it was kind of at that point would have been the kind of center of town, really. Over time, the center of town moved west into the valley that it is in today. Provenance of this church, of the painting, actually descended in through a marriage to the Adams daughter to a granddaughter of Dr. Kassam, and eventually ended up out in Chicago when Daniel E. Kassam, who would have been a great-great-grandson of Dr. Daniel W. Kassam, came back to Huntington and donated it to the church. The painting has been recently restored and is in excellent condition and worth the visit to see. All right, over here we're talking about the second church building. It was built in 1862. In the first decision that had to be made, and the discussion started as early as 1860, was where to build the church. And the town was just beginning to move to the west, and there was a number of congregants that wanted to build a building in the village, the village that was growing in where it is today. There were sentimentalists, I guess, and there were church records that indicate the decision-making process, and the decision was to build a new kind of Victorian church on the same site. There was, and this is several pictures of it. This is from the Park Avenue view. This is from the cemetery view, which is really the front of the church and the interior of the church. And there were a number of significant weddings. As I say, the history of any organization in Huntington is always told through the story of the people that were involved. There was a Dusenberry family in Huntington who came out in 1860, and Edwin was the oldest of the children. It was a New York City, Brooklyn family that would summer and come out and back and forth. And he was the oldest of the siblings. He had several sisters, and they both got married in the church. One got married in 1864, and we have a copy of the wedding certificate there, as well as their photographs. Jenny Dusenberry married Henry Clay Platt, who was a lawyer in town, ended up being a U.S. attorney later on in life, and he gave the major address at the centennial celebration in 1876 here in town. And then her younger sister, Carrie Dusenberry, married an Englishman, Richard Shakeshaft, in 1887. And this is a picture. And at the time, Edwin Dusenberry lived at the Conklin House, which you visited the Victorian parlor with earlier in the evening. And this is a photograph of the wedding party outside the Conklin House in June of 1887. These are some of the church records, again, that we have borrowed from the church. They luckily survived fire and water damage from the fire over the years, and now we're trying to put them into archival position to where they're going to be maintained throughout for the future. This church burned down in 1905, and so there was a decision process that had to go through again on where to build the third church. And there we have some more marriages that were at this church that we'll talk about before we get to the third church building. One of the more historic families in Huntington, and also members of St. John's Episcopal Church, was the family of Admiral Hiram Paulding. He was spent a lifetime in the Navy from the War of 1812 through the Civil War. And in 1838, he married a Brooklyn girl and moved to Huntington and bought a 100-acre farm on Lloyd Harbor. And he had a fairly large family, consisting of 4 daughters and 2 sons. And a number of them became very involved with the St. John's Episcopal Church. He himself was a vestryman in 1838 and served with Dr. Daniel Whitehead Kassam, who was the warden at the time. But it's his children that really had the greatest influence. Now, there were 3 marriages that were involved with the St. John's Church. 2 of them are indicated here in the church records. They were in the same year in 1865, so they would have been in the newly constructed second building. And 2 sisters married 2 brothers, Meade brothers. Both of them were in the Navy and rose to the rank of admiral. Richard Meade married Rebecca, and they became involved and bought a home in Huntington on the east side of the harbor. And he was the captain of the USS Vandalia, and which sailed out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And he would often bring the Vandalia into the harbor in Huntington and practice, to visit his house and to practice target shooting to the rocks on the shores of Lloyd Neck. This is Edward Lang painting. He's another one of our Huntington artists that we have on display here, of the Vandalia, that was done in 1881 when it's recorded in the Long Islander that Admiral Meade brought the Vandalia in for such a visit for about a week. Those 2 sisters had a brother, Hiram II, who also married in the church. His marriage was 10 years later in 1875, and he married Virginia Mulligan, who had a house across the bay. And you can see up there in the map there, the Mulligan estate and the Paulding estate, one in Lloyd Harbor and the other in East Neck. And there are pictures of the 2 sizable houses. The Mulligan estate was considered one of the finest houses on the North Shore of Long Island at the time. And interesting enough, where Hiram Paulding's father was John Paulding, who captured John Andre as the spy during the Revolution, Virginia's grandfather was Hercules Mulligan, who was the best friend of Alexander Hamilton and is noted in the play of Alexander Hamilton. He was a tailor in New York, but was a great patriot. And over here, we're in the final section, really, that's concerning the St. John's celebration of its 275th anniversary, is the construction of the 3rd building. And as I said, just the way there was a discussion in building the 2nd building on where to build it, that same discussion repeated itself some 60 years later. And it's all recorded here in the vestry minutes of the church, the discussion on whether they should build on the same site and the back and forth, or which site to build in the village. It was finally settled on to build where it's today at Prospect, the corner of Prospect Avenue and Main Street, across from the public library down at that end of town. And the building was organized and really by the vestry and the men of the church, but 2 of the great influencers on the church's building and where to build it and what to build it with and how to pay for it came from 2 women that were notable, and we talk about these 2 women kind of on the 100th anniversary of the woman's right to vote finally in 1920. And they were Emma Paulding, who was the youngest daughter of Hiram Paulding, of that family. She never married, but she was tremendously influential in the St. John's activities. And the other one, of course, was Cornelia Prime. And both of the ladies were involved in the construction of the trade school building, which is the headquarters of the Huntington Historical Society today. They were very involved with the construction and the formation of the hospital. They were also very involved in the 3rd building. And we have some pictures here of the groundbreaking ceremonies for the church. Up there we have a groundbreaking ceremony of the trade school building. We have Emma Paulding as an older lady as part of the faculty of the trade school, which was started by St. John's, but then became independent of St. John's when they built the building on Main Street, at 209 Main Street. And another one of the interesting artists that lived in Huntington is kind of affiliated with the church in some way. Earl Mann, who lived in Huntington and painted here, was an illustrator. And he worked a lot of times for the Saturday Evening Post. And this cover from 1956 shows the wedding in St. John's Episcopal Church. One version of the top illustration shows the wedding rehearsal, and the second one, the actual ceremony in the church. Since both times the minister, Reverend Greenoff, had his back to the wedding party, he also put Reverend Greenoff in the audience, and there you see him sitting there to the right in the audience of the wedding. So Earl Mann was another illustrator, another artist who lived in Huntington, and we're able to connect him to this exhibit of the St. John's Episcopal Church.